afternoon. Happy final Tuesday of the sessions. Thank you, Teddy. If anyone else would like to knock wood, it would be appreciated. So we are going to do a walkthrough of 454 this afternoon. To look at the changes that the Senate made, look at the fiscal impact of the changes that the Senate made, and then discuss and vote on whether we're going to make a recommendation for a committee of conference. House Ed is doing the same thing at the same time, focusing on their portions of the bill. It is, if either of us wants a committee of conference, that's what will be recommended, and likely that's, I mean, I think we all know what's going to happen. So, but it's important for us to understand what we're doing before we do that. And that ideally is all going to happen before 3 o'clock when we go back to the floor where a committee of conference can be named and they can start their work tomorrow morning so we can have this be our last Tuesday. And get really good work done for Vermonters. We also our tax credit bill, S51, we had one committee of conference last week. We're going to have another one tomorrow. So tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And I think those are all the updates I have for you thus far. I'm going to try to have us meet every morning so we can all just check in with each other about what's been happening in committees of conference, but likely won't have much work to do as a committee, other than discussing sort of what's going on in the committees of conference. And with that, John, do you want to join us? Thanks. So we're going to hear from John, and then we're going to hear from Kirby, and then we're going to hear from Julia, and then we can have a quick conversation. And I'm going to ask folks to hold questions until we get to the end of whatever the section or change or whatever it is, just so everyone can have a chance to compare sentences.
Noon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I have a couple of things I can screen share, just depending on preference. Beth super helpfully put together a side-by-side, so I could just pull that up. But note that anything where there are no changes wouldn't show the text in the side-by-side. It would just be no changes have occurred at this section. I can also just walk through the.
I'd actually rather walk through the actual bill, and folks can use the side-by-side for their reference or note.
Good. Second.
And folks, we have a printed side-by-side that's just one section, or one series of sections. Sorcia's printing out a new complete side-by-side for us, and that will arrive at your desk any moment now.
Okay, so we are looking at, I'm starting at section 34 of the Senate Proposal Amendment to H454, and this is on page 65.
The air is very loud. Can you speak up a little bit? Or turn. Oh, air purifier.
Oh, John, are you sitting here? Because
We don't need that.
change.
This is where my sections are.
Okay.
There are a number of changes that happen in the beginning of the bill, and they will be visible in the side-by-side. But those I'm not in a position to speak to, just those are Beth's sections, which I think she's currently walking through in Ed.
And we're not going to do those this afternoon for the purposes of discussing a committee of conference. We can do those later.
Okay. So section 34, this is your state funding of public education. These are your Title 16 definitions. So this is where you build in the base amount. I'll flip to on page 66. And this is where you have your EOP definition. These are the same as what passed the House. So your base amount is 15,033. And you're going to be hearing me say a lot, but this is the same as passed the House. So much of this should be familiar. Same for section 35. This is your weighting sections. So this is building out weights for special education. That's your child with a disability, including different categories of disabilities. Your tiered English language weight, including those proficiency levels and newcomer slide. Nothing new here. This is as passed the House, but just if it's helpful for me to go slowly through this, I can as well, but this is the same categories of weighting and the same weights as Dr. Colby recommended.
I think this is a great speed.
The, one of the, we're going to see a light update for one section related to this, but of course, with these updates to the weights, which is the approach that the House took, you pulled out your sparsity weight and your small school weight and replaced those with support grants. We'll come to that shortly, and there's one change you're going to see in the sparsity support grants section. So, section 36, and I'm on the bottom of page 75, same as passed the House. I think of these as conforming change type sections. This is just pulling in all of the new definitions into our current structure. So appropriating funds for your EOP and your supplemental district spending. Nothing new here, but just a reminder, these sections are technical changes you need to make as soon as you have these other education concepts built in. Okay, section 37 at the bottom of page 77, there is going to be a change to this section. So this is your small schools, sparse schools, and support grants section. As passed the House, and this was something that came up on the final day of the vote in this committee, the sparsity support grant was kind of a sparsity district support grant. The assessment of sparsity was made at the district level and went to the total population in the district. What you see here, and I'm on page 78, you have a definition of sparse area. This is a geographic area corresponding to a zip code where the number of persons per square mile residing within that land area as of date of determination, July 1, is fewer than 55 persons. So it's the same sparsity check, which is fewer than 55 persons per square mile, but the geographic boundaries are no longer the district. You're not assessing sparsity at the district level. You're assessing it at the zip code level. So that's what you see here. Same small school support grant, but when you look at the sparse school support grant, you're going to see something slightly different here. So this is, and let me just read out what you previously saw on the House side.
I would like a yellow one. Thank you very much. Continue on, John. I'm so sorry.
You start somewhere.
Zip code.
Okay, I will start this section again. So section 37, this is the first section we're coming to where there are changes against the House passed version. And the changes come down to really this term sparse area. Previously, you had a definition sparse school district, and that was a school district where the number of persons per square mile residing within the land area is fewer than 55 persons. That's been changed to this sparse area determination, and that's at the level of zip code. So a geographic area corresponding to a zip code where the number of persons is that fewer than 55 persons. So same sparsity check, but different boundaries against which you're checking. And so you can imagine that we don't know what the school district configuration is going to be. If you had 5 districts with quite large districts, you might have no sparse districts, or you might have one sparse district, right? But this is trying to get at a sparsity determination that is closer to the actual schools themselves. And so your sparse area is the geographic area corresponding to a zip code. And a sparse school is a school within a sparse area. So previously, subsection C was a sparsity support grant, and that paid to a sparsity support grant to each sparse district in an amount determined by multiplying the 2-year average enrollment of each public school in the district by this 1,954 figure. What you see now is pays a sparse school support grant to each school district sparse school, and that's a school within a zip code that has that fewer than 55 persons, in an amount determined by multiplying the 2-year average enrollment in the sparse school by 1,954. So this is getting at schools that are in sparse areas rather than schools that just happen to be in districts that are deemed sparse at a quite different level, right? So the difference is really, what are the geographic boundaries for determining sparsity. Here it's zip code instead of at the district level. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Same dollar figure. And the school district is receiving that sparsity support grant only for each sparse school within the district.
I would imagine that Julia would be our best path to understanding what the implications of this.
I'm happy for someone else to be the best. Yeah.
But yeah, Representative Wilkins.
I'm just trying to understand. So you could receive a small school grant, but not a sparse school grant.
Yep. I mean, I say that it depends on the definition of small school, right? So one of the things we talked about when the bill was still on the House side, this small by necessity piece. So small school is a school that has fewer than 100 pupils in two-year average enrollment, but also has been determined by the state board to be small by necessity. So we don't know what's going to be baked into that small by necessity determination. It could pick up other considerations like, is it in a sparse area? But without knowing what it is, I think the answer to your question is yes, you could receive a small school support grant without sparsity.
If, just to clarify, if the rules promulgated by the State Board of Education decided it was small by necessity, even if it was in a dense area.
For small school support?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. You could have depending on what the state board says, if they say, we think small by necessity is school that as of today is small, and that's by necessity. That's it. That's the extent of the determination they make. As long as they have fewer than 100 pupils, you could receive a small school support grant, and that's each small school within that school district, you multiply by the two-year average enrollment.
Representative Wilkins.
Yes. John, sorry, I'm multitasking and I should not. The sparse, I know it's now a sparse school grant, but the 1954 is the same.
Yes.
And safe question with the,
Yes, same
given
thing.
it's on the zip code level now, but still 55 persons per square mile.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep, it's the sole change is to what the geographic area within which you make the sparsity determination is. That's the change. The dollar figures are the same. Check on persons per square mile is the same. It's just that you're now assessing it at a zip code level rather than at a district level.
So John, do you know if this overall statewide gives us more of these districts or less? So you think more schools are gonna qualify or fewer?
It will, I don't know the answer, but it will depend on what the school district configuration is, right? So if you had the 5 model, we've talked about, I think in the past, certain models would have produced only one sparse district, right? Whereas under existing law, you have many sparse districts, right? So this is trying to get at a sparsity determination that is more closely linked to where the school is, but we don't know.
There's 326 zip codes in Vermont. That helps you.
And Julia I think has done some of this analysis, but not all of it. And so we can.
Just to make sure I understand, if you live in a zip code that is a sparse area, and that means every student in attendance will be weighted by an extra 1954 in order to go to that school, even though that school might not be in the sparse area.
The school is within the sparse area. That's what this determination is. So sparse school is a school within a sparse area, and the sparse area is the zip code determination.
So if the school's in a non-sparse area, but is receiving kids from a sparse area, they do not.
They don't get a support grant.
It's a grant, not a weight.
It's a grant, not a way. Yep.
And everyone remember when we spent all that time on local option taxes and zip codes and how fun that map was?
Fun's a word.
But it keeps on popping back up, that really nice graphic from past. That might have been before your time, Representative Feltus, but we will, oh well. We can find it again. It was really a great map. I think, John, you missed out on it, but it was one of our more compelling pieces of testimony in history of the Ways and Means Committee. Back to you.
Very upset.
I know.
Section 38. No changes here. This is just describing Ed Fund, so it's going to pick up As a reminder, all revenue paid from that supplemental district spending tax, which is your local tax for supplemental district spending, flow to the ed fund. No change here. This is what passed the House. Section 39, same thing. No changes here. This is cleanup language to the stabilization reserve to remove references to an old act, not a substantive change. And same thing for section 40. This is aligning the calendar of payouts with what we currently do and just picking up the new education concepts, EOP, and supplemental district spending. No change here, same as what the House did. Section 41, which is on page 83, does have a slight change. And I would call it a conforming change for bigger changes that happened in Kirby's section. So section 41 is describing the ballot and the vote that's taken for your supplemental district spending. You're seeing on page 84 are some updates to the information that would be provided. And then on 85, the actual ballot itself. The change here is this subdivision 3, lines 13 through 16, page 84. And what passed the House was that this budget would need to include the anticipated statewide education tax rate as adjusted for each tax classification. Because the tax classification pieces have been pulled out of the bill, you had to make updates here. And so that's what you see here is calls out anticipated homestead tax rate and non-homestead tax rate. So this is just a conforming change for more substantive changes that happen later in the bill. Whatever you do with property classifications need to be picked up here. And so what you have here is just language that aligns with the way the tax rates are described later in the bill. Sections 42, your appeal sections is the same as passed the House. Just noting you do repeal that census grant because you're moving to a special education weight. Again, same as the House. Section 43 is your reserve. You'll recall that this is made available for initial miscalculations or if there's slight errors in the math, you could use some of that supplemental district spending that is recaptured through that imposition of the local rate to offset that deficit, and then the remainder would flow to your school construction aid special fund. Same provisions here, no changes. Sections 44 and 45 are reports. The first from AOE related to transportation reimbursement guidelines. Section 45 reports from JFO on inflationary measures and pre-K funding. Those are both the same as the House. And then we are coming to some new material that did not show up in the House version. And that is starting on page 88. So the first of these is section 45A. This is JFO shall contract with a contractor with experience in Vermont's education funding system to develop a cost factor foundation formula. It includes tiered weights for CTE, English learners, and special education, and any other weights determined to be empirically necessary for an adequate and equitable education. Contractors to recommend suitable geographic measures for determining sparsity within that formula and shall specifically address the effects of using zip code. So thinking back to that sparsity support grant, there's some concern that maybe the zip code doesn't work, but there could be potential issues there. So it's currently kind of a proxy for getting at a tighter geographic determination. And this is including as part of this report an assessment of what is the best geographic measure for determining sparsity. Is there something you could use other than zip code?
Yeah. Is there a reason why we're asking them to, the same contractor to do both of those things? This doesn't seem. Well, you can't say anything, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if I could offer like what my read of the situation is, it's that there was a lot of anxiety about the inputs to the foundation formula. And so this is a report on a cost factor foundation formula. You already have a cost factor foundation formula in the bill, right? But this is a report to take some more time. And specifically, the call out you'll see is this weights for CTE, something that you don't see in the existing foundation formula. So that was one of the requests, is what to do about CTE when you're building out this cost factor foundation formula. And given that they're doing a wholesale assessment of the foundation formula, they could address this use of zip code as a sparsity measure.
So is there any discussion, since we're not going over the education portion, of how we got to assuming that a weight was the right way to handle CTE? Because this doesn't even seem consistent with the APA report.
I have no idea. I think that's gonna be a question that we'll ask in the committee of confidence. About how they went with that.
So what your vote?
My opinion
Not her,
on,
on what you just asked. Well, that's an opinion.
the only thing I would say about education is it's very difficult to talk about funding if you haven't made decisions around programs and governance. So I don't know that you can even have a rational conversation about this without having made some of the decisions that could have been made after reading the EPA report, but which weren't addressed or put in the.
but both APA and Colby have been fairly clear in various pieces of testimony that a wait for CTE is not, waiting CTE is just not a thing that's done by, like, that's not a best practice for education finance.
Right, which is,
Yes.
but I think there are so many issues here. I don't think we have time to go through all those issues today. So maybe we should just.
Present what was that?
Just to make sure I'm following correctly. So back on page 78, when we were talking about the Sparks area, et cetera. So basically what this draft says is that for the time being, sparse shall be defined as fewer than 55 persons within a zip code. And then section 45A is saying, just in case that's incorrect, we're going to have a contractor go through and
That's exactly right. And the thing to note, of course, is that you're just receiving a report. It's up to the legislature as to what to do with those recommendations.
Yeah.
Is there, did they discuss hiring somebody as opposed to spending more money on consultants for the same thing?
Did the Senate discuss that on Thursday evening? I have absolutely no idea. I'm sorry.
The report would include a detailed explanation of the analysis of the work done to arrive at those recommended weights and whether it costs more to educate a secondary student than an elementary student in Vermont. You can see both the CTE and the secondary pieces obviously attributable to the differences in inputs to the foundation formula as we're emerging across the Senate and the House, right? Because earlier versions of the Senate bill included weights for secondary students and CTE. Contractor would submit that foundation formula and analysis of geographic measures to committees of jurisdiction on or before December 1, 26. So this is some ways out. This is not an immediate report. You know, many of the other reports are due at the end of this year. This is December 1 of 26.
Didn't we just do this work? And so we didn't, is this that we did not like what the contractor told us? So we're now going to go hire another contractor until we get a different story? Is that basically what this is?
I absolutely cannot explain why the Senate put anything in this bill. I'm not being trying to be evasive. I just genuinely have no idea why the sentence is in here. But that's what we'll ask them in a committee conference.
$150,000 appropriated to hire a consultant for the purpose of that selection. Section 45B is also a new section. So these are transitionary measures with the rollout. And perhaps I should have started my testimony by saying this does align with the House's timeline. This is foundation formula rollout in FY30, so July 1, 2029. There is an additional contingency built in, which I can speak to at some point. But just noting, this does not have an accelerated timeline as you might have seen in early versions of the Senate bill. So what this section 45B does is it builds in transitioning to the EOP. So across 5 years, although what you're going to see are 4 years listed here because it's 4 years in which you're actually transitioning, and in the 5th year, you're fully transitioned. You're moving people off of their education spending and onto the EOP. And it's done in these 20% differences, right? So I'm going to go down to transition gap and come back to explain this. The transition gap on page 90 is the gap between your EOP and a school district's ed spending in FY28. So whatever that gap is, you're dividing it into 5, and you're transitioning across 5 years to get from, if you're below, you're going to be moved upward 20% of the gap each year toward that EOP. And if your ed spending is above what your EOP would be, you're moved across 5 years downward to your EOP. Does that make sense? The one thing I would throw out to make this slightly more complicated is that the transition gap is done each year, right? So it's the amount subtracting your EOP from your ed spending in FY '28, meaning it's not always going to be the same 20% increment each year, but it's trying to smooth the transition across those 5 years.
So base amount changes every year, so then you're taking a percentage of a different amount.
The gap will be a different amount each year. The point against which you're comparing in each year is the same. It's your FY '28 ed spending, but there might be some fluctuation in your EOP across years, right? Based on what your student counts are and the like, what their various weighting is. So you could end up with slightly different or maybe meaningfully different EOPs. But the idea is to slowly move you towards your EOP across those years. And so each year you would determine the transition gap and you might have variance from year to year, but you would be getting this percentage that you see here to move you in basically 20% increments over time for that EOP.
And I was really hoping the Senate would come up with a transition plan, and I'm looking forward to understanding this one better, though it does seem confusing.
I was just thinking that it's an approach, it's approaching zero, but never gets.
Yeah, so in fiscal year 2034, you get your EOP. That's the end result of this, right? Is you have your 80% of the gap in 30, 60% of the gap, right? So if you think about it as not being determined each year and accept that at face value, like imagine that it's just a one-time determination. I think it's easy to see that you're moving in 20% across that gap each year so that you eventually hit your EOP. And then if you accept that to actually move to your EOP, you need to make that determination each year. You can see how we don't know in FY '30 what your FY '34 EOP is going to be. So we can't determine that transition gap, right? We just don't know. So this is like an approximation of getting at that smoothly moves you toward that EOP.
But it doesn't happen towards infinity. It ends on a date certain.
It does end on a date certain. Good.
I got that.
That would be more fun.
It would be.
Representative Bodie.
So now I'm trying to think. What are the perverse incentives?
Um,
Make your, let's just say I see that there's phase in. Now, can you use numbers to show me what you would do if you wanted more help in the transition to get to the EOP versus if
For
you
sure.
weren't thinking about it?
If you wanted to receive more money in those transition years, you would bump up your ed spending in FY '28.
That's just what I thought.
But it needs to, but just to be clear, it needs to be above the EOP that you would receive. If you boost it up, but you're someone who's below the EOP, it's not going to result in you. I mean, it will slowly move you towards your EOP.
So because that mathematically makes sense, because that's what I was thinking, well, just bump up for it. Then what do we need to include in this so that it is not going to benefit you to suddenly be spending a whole lot more, getting ready to spend a whole lot more in 2028?
That's a really good question. Is there anything in the bill that addresses that?
There is nothing special in the bill that addresses that, but there's the normal constraint that you do have to fund it in the year that you vote your FY '28 ed spending. So you would have to pay that, right? You would have to pay your property taxes for that year to get that bump.
But isn't that true of every transition? Why wouldn't every K-8 just tuition their seventh graders so they could be in small school and get $6,000 more ahead? Well, now, see, that's a tuition question, which I don't know. You know all about tuitioning. I'm not, know all about tuition, so then I need to hear that example slowly so I understand it. If any transition, you get perverse incentives.
And we can have, and when Julia comes, she can talk more about the transition.
So I just want to prevent, perverse incentives,
Absolutely.
making it like what we had when all of a sudden there was a cap in there.
Yes, lesson learned. Thanks for remembering it. Done.
I leave all difficult things to be ironed out by Julia. So section 45C.
Hard things are hard, John.
They are indeed. Section 45C, this is this was not something included in the House version. This was a request from the tax department. The Ed Fund Advisory Committee is currently in law, right? But the first meeting is to be called before July 15th of this summer. Given the massive changes in the ed funding system, the request was that this be moved back to 27.
Seems like an even better reason to meet sooner.
That's what I thought.
There you go.
We will take that up with the tax department.
There you go. Section 46, we're now shifting gears a little bit. You're jumping to Title 32, which is the imposition of your education tax rates. The changes that you're going to see here flow again from a more substantive change that happens in Kirby's sections, which is with the removal of the property tax classifications. You'll recall that we previously, oh gosh, did I? No, okay, sorry. I just jumped ahead of my own notes. There is a slight change here to the definition on page 93 of supplemental district spending. And it relates to your 10% cap. So supplemental district spending, this is the spending that the voters approve in excess of their EOP, provided that they shall not approve spending in excess of 10% of, and what was in the House version was 10% of EOP, which is a weighted number, right? EOP reflects base times your weighted long-term membership. The cap here is 10% of the product of the base amount and the school district's long-term membership. So it's basically an unweighted cap. This is a lower cap than was proposed by the House. It's basically an unweighted foundation amount is the way to do it.
Would it be okay if we saw that in an example?
Yes, Julia will do that.
Oh,
And we did when we were, I have a vague memory of us talking about whether to use a weighted cap or an unweighted cap before we sent it over. I think there's a strong argument towards an unweighted cap, but.
And just, some of the like theoretical or philosophical justification behind it is that you're capturing the educational differences among students in your EOP. You're recognizing the differences with the weights there. You may not need to do that with your supplemental spend, right? These could be discrete projects that don't need to pick up an extra cap amount for a school district just because you have weighted students, if those differences are adequately captured in your EOP. But policy question. Section 47, this is what I started to describe. I had to make updates to this section because of the removal of the property tax classifications. So previously you recall that there was a table that set out the different classifications and had a factor of 1 for each. You would set one statewide education tax rate in the December 1 letter, and that would be multiplied by the factors in that table to give you your rates specific to homestead, non-homestead, and the various categories. With the removal of the property tax classifications, what you have here is statewide rate is set at a uniform tax rate for non-homestead and a uniform tax rate for homestead, sufficient to cover expenditures from the ed fund other than supplemental district spending. And those would be set each fiscal year by act. So this is just a conforming change for the removal of the property tax classifications, but note that it does not prescribe the relationship between the non-homestead and homestead. It just says you're going to set a homestead rate and you're going to set a non-homestead rate. Doesn't take a position on how they would relate to each other.
In the bill we sent over, there was nothing to cause them to be different from each other. Is there
That's
anything
right.
in the bill that came back that would cause them to behave differently?
There's nothing that would cause them to be different.
So this,
Although I say that what you could say about the version that you guys passed is that it was definitive as to the relationship between them.
Yeah.
It's one, they're all the same until you change those factors. This does not say that the relationship is 1-to-1. It could be that your non-homestead property tax rate bears a huge portion of the liability or a small portion of the liability, right?
but the supplemental spending
Still the same.
still applies to both.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And it also doesn't then include that the homestead would be affected differently by the amount per people spending. That's what the. It's not there.
There's no variation in the homestead to account. Yeah. I think that's the question. Yeah. There are just conforming changes scattered throughout these sections. So for instance, we had references to statewide tax rate throughout these sections. That's been updated to reference homestead or non-homestead rate. There is a substantive change in subsection C2, which is on page 96. On page 17, what you see here is existing law. The Secretary of Education shall determine the net non-homestead education tax payment and net homestead education tax payment. The House version had the Commissioner of Taxes doing this determination, right? And switched that net determination to be made by tax department rather than by ed. the tax department voiced on the Senate side that actually education is the entity that is the best positioned entity to do this. So Senate reverted back to existing law on these pieces. You're going to see the same change made for your supplemental district spending tax rate. On page 98, there's nothing different about the calculation here in terms of how it is conducted. Same mechanisms as you guys have. But at the bottom of page 99, it's the Secretary of Education determining those net payments rather than the Commissioner of Taxes. We next come to the December 1 letter, which is your section 48. And the changes that you see here are conforming changes from removal of the property tax classifications. Previously, as the House passed version, the December 1 letter would have recommended a statewide education tax rate, which would then be multiplied by factors rate. Now the December 1 letter would be recommending a non-homestead property tax rate, a homestead property tax rate, and the remaining pieces. So just picking up those that you're providing a uniform homestead property tax rate and a uniform non-homestead property tax rate. Otherwise, the December 1 letter is the same.
And is it still happening a year out so that districts know that when they're setting their budget?
I think that is the intention here. There's been no, disruption of the timeline proposed by the House.
They still have a problem in that if we pass legislation that increases spending, they can't know their budget. You're out, even if we send.
But we can come closer than we do under current law.
So for example, today we passed another bill that is going to increase ed spending.
Yeah.
And there's no accounting for that. Unfunded.
Do you have a solution to that,
Yes.
Representative?
I'll let Representative Odie.
Representative Odie, do you have a solution to that? That would fit within the
Say that-
parameters of this
Yes.
bill right now?
That any unfunded mandates, because they'd have to be unfunded, like once we pass that, would have to wait till the following year to come into,
I think that is a lovely gesture. We can't tie the hands of future legislators, but it would be a
well,
nice.
it would be a
thing.
nice message.
Yep.
And certainly they could, the legislature could say, oh, I see. Well, we'll pay for this year out of the general fund. And then next year, the ed fund will take over. So they can understand.
Can you look in the bill to see where that might fit into the differences between the two? To see if we could go in a committee of conference.
Yeah.
Not right now, but when we're done.
Okay.
Okay. On page 102, section 48A, this is going to look awfully familiar, but what we talked about, this is a transitionary measure for your rates. But as opposed to the move to your EOP, this is how your tax rate is going to be affected. So the mechanic should look quite similar, but it works differently. This is basically providing discounts. I don't want to use the word penalty, but I'm going to use the word penalty. Discounts or penalties to a district's homestead property tax rate based on where they fall relative to what their tax rate would be if you moved immediately to the foundation level. So this looks a lot like what you saw before. But if you think about what's being done here, you have to set the rate sufficient to cover all of your expenditures. So that is, you can't do a tax rate transition that doesn't provide taxes sufficient to cover your costs, right? So this is accepting that you're setting taxes sufficient to cover your expenditures. And then your transition gap is the difference between the property tax rate for that FY30 if you had no transition. So what would be required to cover your expenditures for the year? The difference between that and the homestead property tax rate that you had in fiscal year 29. And then you're moving people, you're moving districts across 5 years in those 20% increments to smooth their homestead tax rate. But it's different from the transition for the EOP because you still have to have taxes sufficient to raise the expenditure. So what you're getting is a cent discount or a cent penalty based on where your homestead FY29 rate falls relative to what would be your FY30 rate if you didn't have this transition mechanism.
So there were some errors in the 127 weights that we're addressing here.
Wait, are you asking Julia a question?
Yeah, no, oh, I'm doing, well, have we even modeled this? Do we have any idea what this
Let's
is?
wait until Julia's here. Just questions for John for now.
Okay.
Representative
In discussions with the Senate, was it ever brought up that if it was determined from the base, from the foundation formula, they should be spending $1,000 more per child immediately? Was there any concern as to any liability that that school district would have if it was not given that foundation formula day one in terms of equity?
So just to be clear, this, under this proposal, do you mean for the EOP transition?
Yeah.
That was not addressed, no. But I think that's a fair thing to ask about, right? Is you've determined a specific amount that you think is what you should fund students at, and then you're slowly moving folks to that EOP, meaning that in those first 4 years, you're providing under the amount that is designated in the foundation formula. Just to call out, this specific piece doesn't relate to that, right? The tax rate transition is separate. This is just for doing discounts or penalties to your tax rate, but the EOP, you could have one without the other. Right? These are separate transition mechanisms.
Can I ask a question about her? This is for John. I'm just trying to understand how this works because this is silent on how districts allocate
For sure.
within, except that we are setting tuition equal to the foundation plan plus weights. So this would significantly redistribute within a district, right? And so if you didn't fund them adequately, they would be able to actually make the payment that we now set.
So I guess the question is the tuition amount prorated or adjusted to?
I don't think that it is in this version. I would need to,
That's a great flag.
So for example, Kingdom East spends something like $10,000 at the elementary level. We're saying they should spend 15. They spend something like 30,000 at the high school level.
What page is,
How you transition that?
Yeah.
I'm not true.
what page is the flip side of this one?
I'm trying to find the tuition.
I got it. 89.
John, can you just talk through the definition of transition gap again for this
Yes.
section?
And just to confirm, section 27 is your tuition section. And it provides that a district pays to a receiving school an amount equal to the base amount multiplied by the sum of one in any way it's applicable. Does not have a specific transition for the tuition piece, which is, I think, what your question was tied to. So transition gap. The amount, whether positive or negative, that results from subtracting the homestead property tax rate for FY30, were it calculated assuming no transition. So that's what would your uniform homestead tax rate be for all districts if you weren't doing this transition to cover the expenditures from the ed fund? You take that and you subtract it from the district's homestead property tax rate in FY29. And this produces a fixed figure. This is not something that is asked each year. This is literally, you're going to move 20% of that gap each year across this period, unlike the EOP transition, which was determined each year, right? And so you're just taking the gap between what your homestead rate would be in the absence of it, and then what your FY29 homestead property tax rate would be. And so then when the tax rates are actually calculated, basically, I think the way that this works is first, folks in the December 1 letter will think about what would it be if you had no transition mechanism. They'll have that rate. Then you determine this gap on that basis. And then afterwards, you have to ask, now what rate, assuming the transition is built in, that people are getting these 20% gaps, right? What would the tax rate, what would the uniform tax rate need to be, accounting for those discounts and penalties sufficient to cover expenditures from the ed fund? And then what a district actually receives is this transition gap, which will result in either discounts or penalties to that uniform rate, right? In that year. Does that, it's separate. Basically, you have to set expenditures as a fixed cost. You need to raise those. And then you're giving people a discount or a penalty, depending on where they fall relative to the rate sufficient to raise that.
I remember when we started the session, we were going to make property taxes simpler.
I will say this is just a transition, right? This goes away and what would be the output of this is cents. It would just show like that you're getting cents off or cents on the tax rate, right?
I think our first day of the session, we talked about continued tension between simplicity and equity. Representative Boston.
So true. Okay, next, section 49, these are just conforming changes, so nothing too substantive to talk about here. No changes to section 49. And in section 50, just a flag that the references here are to homestead property tax rate and non-homestead property tax rate as against statewide education property tax rate. Again, this is a conforming change that flows from removal of the property tax classifications. So whatever happens with those sections will affect this section 50. We come to section 51, no change. We're now in the section dealing with the repeal of the PTC and creation of the homestead exemption. The concept is the same here, right? You're repealing PTC, replacing with a homestead exemption, but the actual exemption itself involves different income brackets and different caps, outside caps. And that starts in section 6066. Pause my screen share to flip to that, just so I don't upset folks.
You'll just flip away.
On page 109, this is where you're going to see the heart of the changes. So section 66 is your current income sensitivity measures. This is where your statewide property tax credit is built in. That language is struck just as the House did. But what you see starting on the bottom of page 110 and continuing on to 111 is the creation of a new structure for your homestead exemption. So this caps out at a household income of 100,000, as you can see, an eligible claimant who owned the homestead on April 1 and whose household income does not exceed $100,000 shall be entitled to a homestead property tax exemption in an amount determined as follows, and it's set out in tables. So if you're under 50,000, so at the very bottom, if you're between 0 and 10,000, you're entitled to a homestead property tax exemption against the first $425,000 in house site value of 99%. So basically a near total exemption against the first $425,000 in house site value. Just to call out this is specific to an exemption against that 425,000. You would not get a $425,000 exemption, right? You're getting an exemption against the first 425,000. Anything above that is fully taxed, right? There's no exemption available against that. And then if you're between 45 and 50, you're getting an 80% homestead property tax exemption against that first 425,000. You're seeing two tables here because there's a different house site value cap in the second table, and that's 400,000. So new income brackets, new exemptions. You will see a graph that shows a blue wave, as people have described this. And the structure that the Senate landed on was an attempt to try to congregate the benefits folks at low incomes and low property values. And this was the structure proposed to have that picture of benefits accruing in the top left corner of the graph. It'll be way more clear once you have the graph that I'm talking about in front of you. But that was the thinking behind this. Otherwise, it's the same concept that's passed the House, right? Just new income brackets and a cap on the house site value against which that exemption is available. You'll recall that the House version didn't have a cap on house site value against.
Where is the,
It's built into the headers for the tables. So if you're on page 111, the rightmost column, entitled to a homestead property tax exemption against the first
it's
425.
against the first 425, but if your home is 500, then it's against the first 425. So you're not booted out of eligibility.
You're not booted out of eligibility. It's just that there's no exemption available against that 50K.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And similar here, you would have no exemption against the 100K.
Okay.
Okay.
Very different from current law where you're sort of just booted out of eligibility, right? That's
If this is available to everyone within the income bracket,
Representative Bodie?
I am concerned about it's the cap being 110 instead of 115 and
You mean 100?
it's 100.
100. I'm looking straight at it and I said 100. 100 versus 115. I can recall a conversation that I had with Representative Janet Ansel several years ago. And I said, what do you think? Next thing is that we should really try to help. And she said, between up to 120. That is a really household income and they need more help. So cutting this off at 100 does not smart to me.
Agreed. I'm looking forward to the chart from Julia. 'Cause I think that so when it was in our committee, we were using green and red, which I thought was more fun and non-neutral. And we were trying to turn as much green as possible from red. But we'll see what they did. Yeah.
To explain why it is capped at 100, and I think Julia will speak to this as well. It wasn't a specific position on think, where they believe folks most deserve to receive income sensitivity benefits. The directive was to maximize benefits in this corner of the chart and the key piece, to maintain the same cost as the current property tax credit. So the proposal here is intended to cost the same as the existing property tax credit. If they had done something more costly, they could have built out higher brackets, right?
And I personally find that a weird box or trap that they set for themselves because the cost of the property tax credit changes every year and it's a somewhat arbitrary number for how much it costs this particular year. And if folks wanna, I can pass around the outlook across the years chart, which I've been carrying around with me since you had it, Charlie, thank you. To see how much that credit cost has changed year to year based on no policy changes, just economic differences.
Am I correct in thinking that in recalling that the cost of our package with unlimited is 45 million? The cost of 400, this is, was 35.
Those are great questions for Julia.
You're definitely in the ballpark. But, yep. The remainder of this section 52, which I'll just call out, is annoying to look through because unlike other sections, it's amending a whole chapter. So this section is huge. But the remainder of this section is just conforming changes for the removal of the property tax classifications. So there's not really anything to show throughout the remainder of the section. That's the sole change to pay attention to in this section 52 is that chart you're just looking at, or the tables you were just looking at. The next differences really occur at section 53A. Is all the way down on page 125. Section 53 is your homestead declaration form. There's been no change to that, right? For this new homestead exemption, let's come up with information for the homestead declaration that captures that. But section 53A is a new report for the Department of Taxes, and this is in part tied to the rollout of the tables that you just looked through. I think the Senate Finance, chose to pursue this set of income sensitive measures in the homestead exemption, but they felt some concern that maybe they hadn't gotten far enough with the proposal. So this is tasking Department of Taxes with thinking harder and longer about this same question. So as you see, the intent of the General Assembly is to transition.
Harder and longer. And
The intent is to transition from the existing credit system toward an income-based homestead exemption, and then on or before January 15 of 26, Department of Taxes in consultation with JFO to submit a proposal designing a homestead exemption structure that minimizes the property tax impacts for homestead property owners under the new EDS tax structure, minimizes benefit cliffs compared to the existing credit system, and minimizes the aggregate fiscal impact relative to the existing credit system. So that is building in that box. We were talking about the box that's cabinet with these, and would include with its proposal recommendations for inflationary measures suited to those income sensitivity and house site value measures, so that these could grow over time. The next pieces are the same through section 56. But we are going to come to a change in our future review of foundation formula section. So this is starting on page 128. For the Ed Fund Advisory Committee, you're going to see an addition on page 129. So as passed the House, the Ed Fund Advisory Committee was tasked with recommendations on national best practices for addressing inter-school district effects, including the use of weighting factors, whether to transition to an evidence-based foundation formula. And the new language that you see here is subdivision J on line 7. Methods for ensuring school districts spend their educational opportunity payments on the costs that underlie Vermont's foundation formula. So folks are receiving this bucket of money. Are they spending it on the rationale for them receiving that money in the form that they do, right? So the weights generate an amount of money. Are they actually spending the extra money they receive for special education on special education, for instance? Are they spending the support grants on the things that support those things? It's checking in on how can you ensure that school districts funnel or allocate the money in ways that are tied to why they receive that money.
You're checking in to see if a foundation formula payment is acting like a categorical grant.
I guess that's the way you could describe
Sorry,
it.
sorry. I shouldn't have asked you that.
I think it's a way of saying school districts could receive these amounts of money based on a weighted student count, but then spend it entirely on something unrelated to the student count, right? And so I think this is a task to see how can you best allocate those, like what measures can you include to allocate those funds properly?
And I guess the question I would ask is if student outcomes are better on the other side of it, why do we care? But that's a question for the Senate. Yes.
Are they proposing tons of staffing for this, particularly as we lose federal staff associated with compliance, which is the only way to meet our current accountability requirements?
I have nothing new on that. Yep.
And this is for the Ed Fund Advisory Committee's duties,
Yep.
which is not a staffed committee. It's something we created in one case.
No, I'm just saying, like, the state currently could not meet our existing state accountability requirements if it weren't for federal staffing. So I'm wondering, as we move the federal staffing, how we're proposing to meet state accountability, let alone this, which is quite onerous.
Yes.
I wanted to say no, on that, because
No on what?
on that section that they added, because when I first got here, I was like, we need to be able to follow the money as goes to the school district. Oh, can't be done, can't be done. Uniforms, thing of accounts, return accounts, and no, this doesn't show it. You know, this is be complicated. Paying the teachers and teachers in that classroom. You don't, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So I don't think it belongs here. It belongs with how we get everybody in line with figuring out where everything's spent, which is complicated. I'm gonna have to say, no,
Great. Thanks.
My remaining sections, section 58 and 59 are the same as passed the House. These are your placeholder sections these are contingently effective. So if you transition in the future to an evidence-based foundation formula, these are placeholder amounts that require the legislature basically to go back. Otherwise you end up with these arbitrary base amount. And this is the same as passed the House, but no change here. And that is the full extent of my sections in the bill. As you can see, much of this is the same as passed the House. But there are a few differences, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys may have, or I can turn it over to others.
I think we're ready for Kirby. Yes? Okay. Hi, Kirby. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all that, John. Appreciate it.
This question while we're transitioning.
Yes.
I'm really struggling with the use of evidence base because it's taking a broad term from specific vendor. Is there
Yes.
another way to refer to this that isn't using a term of art for field to refer to a specific vendor?
Like, if you can come up with one, we will all try to use it.
Because that's what he means. Yes. He's asking us to move to Picus.
Who's he?
Whoever wants, I mean, the evidence-based model is the Picus model. let's just call it the Picus model, because that's.
Okay, let's call this a modified PICUS model, because it's
Yes.
pretty far off from PICUS at this point too.
I'm not arguing with that.
Okay, great. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
Does it need the whiteboard or can we just do it?
Now, we
Okay, great. Kirby, you're up.
Good afternoon. Kirby Keaton, Legislative Council. I'm joining Zoom. Is it okay if I use a side-by-side?
We would, if you don't mind, we would rather through just the language so we remember,
Okay.
so we remember things. But if you want a paper side by side, so you can be looking at it while you do it with us, I can give you mine.
No, I have a digital side-by-side I was share.
No, I mean, like, if you don't want to have two things going inside your computer at once and you want to use the side by side to talk to us, I can give you the paper one.
It's okay.
Okay.
My stuff is simple enough that winging it is going to be fine. Okay, so we're at section 60 of the Senate proposal of amendment on page 131. In section 60, you will see that the change to the definition of parcel that has to do with data collection is still there. The reference to property classifications is not there. Because the one big change was removal in these sections that we're about to look at of the classification system and setting that up, and instead replacing it with a study, which we'll see in section 61. Section 61 used to be part of the establishment of property classification system. And now it says, on or before December 15th of this year, in consultation with relevant stakeholders, Department of Taxes will submit a written report to legislative committees regarding the establishment of a system for property tax classifications that would allow for different tax rates on different classes of property. The report shall include one or more ways to define, identify, and classify residential property based on present day use. Residential property is used there because the classification systems that were considered in the House version meant creating new categories or new classifications for non-homestead properties that were residential, either apartment or second home, right? So we'll look at that. Second, a proposed method for classifying mixed use. Third, proposed methods for collecting the data necessary to administer the program.
So instead of putting it into law and then giving them a few years to figure out how to implement it, we're asking them to figure out how to implement it before we put it into law.
That would be a good way to summarize that. Yes. So 4, do you want me to keep going on the list?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So fourth, this report would propose method for appeals under the new system. Fifth, it would propose methods to ensure taxpayer compliance with the new system, including ways to prevent taxpayers from circumventing the legislative intent. This provision relates to the potential compliance issues the Department of Taxes has testified on throughout this process on this, including some known potential issues that exist, such as if you're trying to have a classification for apartments in Vermont, there's different ways that you can sort of create an LLC, create an entity of some kind and set things up in a way in which a property has a landlord certificate associated with it. That's not really that situation. But, things like that are for the department to think about working around when they come back. So there's the classification study. Again, that would be.
Kirby, I don't think in our language we specifically called out short-term rentals, so they've put that in there.
You didn't specifically call out short-term rentals, but the way that the non-homestead residential category was set up is that short-term rentals would fall into that because they would not be homesteads and they would not have a landlord certificate, and they would be residential properties. The regional assessment districts, is not changed. There is some clarifying, there were some clarifying changes with some language here. And I think that had to do with the transition language. Yeah, the only changes in the regional assessment district sections, so the next 2 or 3 sections here. We're just in the transition to call out that reappraisal orders will not have effect except for those that are part of a regionalized appraisal system. It was pointed out by the Department of Taxes that when you say they don't have effect, that might mean forever. So just so that someone doesn't think that this session law is now PBR shall not ever have a reappraisal order ever again, that's not what is intended. So that's what this clarification is about. So that was it for the additions in that section. There's still the regional assessment district working group, which came from the House. So that stuff is all the same for as far as all the substance. And then we have the miscellaneous tax provisions. Those are all the same. I'll just quickly review what they are. In section 65 on page 137, there's the change that's just adding some language back that inadvertently disappeared from statute. In section 66, there's the addition relating to tax sales about a minimum debt of $1,500 before a tax sale can be initiated.
That was the same, right?
Same. All these are the same. There's just one additional miscellaneous provision, but none of the existing ones were changed. Section 67 has to do with the hearing officer pay. Section 68 is removing the reference to the $15 PTC late fee. And then this section 69 is new, and it's taking a tweak related to the statewide adjustment that we did last year. When we were putting the math into words and statute, we added it in a place that caused it to the statewide adjustment to be applied twice if you actually did the math that way. I don't think anyone's done the math that way, but so we're just cleaning that up. That's it for my sections.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
So much work, so few pages.
So true.
So much work and so few pages.
That is very true.
Thank you.
That is very true. It's just like if we're talking about hours per page, yeah, I have the highest ratio.
Any more questions for Kirby? Yeah.
Oh, I should have mentioned, I'm sorry. They did remove all of the conforming sections on transitioning to the January 1 grand list date. And that wasn't in front of my face, so I didn't remember at the time.
Why?
Basically because there's already a transition report in the assessment districts, the stakeholder group thing, to have tax come back with that language.
Okay.
So instead of just doing it now, have tax come back. My understanding is they plan to work off of those conforming changes that I put in there in the first place, but to screen it through their stakeholder group to make sure that it all makes sense with other people. Because there's been 1 or 2 things that have come up throughout the session where we've realized that not only am I not necessarily in a position to know whether that's a good date for the people out there doing it, but even the tax department didn't know. For instance, Forest Parks and Rec are interested in certain current use deadlines.
Yeah.
And to change those or not would affect others other than just the tax department. So that's basically why.
Yeah, it's your turn. Sorcha has more printouts for us. Can you imagine if you already have them?
Which one?
No, I don't. We noticed a typo in the appropriation. It's hot off the press. It's a corrected version.
Got it.
So you can, there's one number that we can cross out and write in the right number or print out the version.
I think we can all do that.
Takes a little, they're kind of large, so I'll print out the first.
Color.
Can I ask a question while we're transitioning?
Mhm.
Are we going to, I know we're not doing it today, but are we going to do a walkthrough of the legislative language about the policy at any point over the course of this week?
I think so,
Okay.
but it might make sense for us to
Just watch that.
just watch House Ed.
Okay.
Yeah. We talked about doing a joint hearing, but it felt like we wouldn't be able to go deep enough on the sections we wanted to go deep enough
Mhm.
on with a joint meeting, so, yeah. If folks can, I'm gonna make that into more of a decision. If folks can watch the House Ed hearing and then let me know if there's more you want to do.
Okay.
With Beth after you watch the House Ed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, YouTube. Thanks, Julia Richter. Floor is yours.
Got it. Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. So before we go into it, there is one typo in the fiscal note that you were just handed out. On page 2 of the fiscal note, there is a big table with all of the costs and appropriations included in the bill. I'll direct you to sections 32 and 33. The third bullet says one-time general fund appropriation of, and then has the wrong number, it should be 2,637,500 to AOE for contracted services. I actually guess I can pull it up.
What's that number one more time, Julie?
I will pull it up and then read it out loud. Because I struggle with listening sometimes. So this is the number, there was a. So that is the only difference in this version that's online and the color copies you have in front of you.
And the 3.4 million is still correct?
Yeah. It says 2,637,500.
That's wise.
There was a Scrivener's error in the version of the bill anyways, long story that I guess is not relevant for your committee, but
Thanks.
you got the right number.
Thank you to everyone who hustled to fix that before 1 o'clock today. And thanks to Ezra.
So, Madam Chair, would you like me to go through the fiscal note, address certain questions, go through the homestead exemption changes? What would be the most helpful?
Let's do a quick on the fiscal note highlighting changes. And then if we can go through the homestead exemption.
Yeah.
Supplemental district.
Yep. Thanks. So, a lot of the fiscal note should look pretty familiar. Of course, the bill makes a number of changes that are contingent on other outstanding policy changes, so the overall fiscal impact is still unclear, same as it was as it passed out of this committee. The foundation formula is, and corresponding tax pieces are also still contingent on school district boundaries, which is up and running, which is consistent with this committee's work. Fiscal year 2026, we've got that school district redistricting task force with $100,000 appropriation for a consultant. This State Board of Ed's rules review is still the same as when it came out of here. There's still the special ed strategic plan. The AOE transformation appropriation, this was put in the Senate side, pulled out the ed transformation dollars that were carried in the budget and were put in this bill. The rationale behind that was the budget went before the ed transformation bill had been sorted out. So they just pulled the 4 million from the budget to be included in this bill.
Yes, represent.
Did they ever provide a breakdown of what that 2.6 would be used for? They said they were going to.
They provided a memo and a
So it's that same memo, which just says generically 2.69 per contract.
I think that there's a little bit more, but I can, I would defer to the agency. I can pull up the documents and send them to Sourcia that they sent to SAC Senate appropriations.
Yeah, that'd be great. Or, and folks could check in with Senate Appropriations about it as well.
But I will admit, I did not spearhead the AOE appropriations. I'm not as well versed in those.
You could just have the memo though, give us a start.
I'll send it, yes. Then there's also some other costs in the bill, the school district redistricting task force, the per diems. This would be to ADS. No appropriation made in the bill for that. School construction, this is consistent with what passed out of the House. Compensation adjustment, this is a miscellaneous tax piece. I don't recall if this was in your version of the bill.
So Julie, on that, per diem for the. Doesn't say,
So this is a summary table. So then the bill itself, the fiscal note itself, I can slow down each.
no, it's just the missing words in the table. Right there.
Section 3.
13,000.
Second
Per
column.
diems for the.
Per diems for that, oh. Thank you. Another, we were working up
Don't say
in
you were working, so it's really, it's,
2:00 to
Yes.
get this ready for you.
it's been very fast.
What are they for? Per diems for the.
For the members of the school district redistricting task force.
Okay, thank you.
Could even just say per diems. You
Um,
don't even have to finish the sentence. You can just shorten the sentence. It's fine. And then what's
yeah,
that?
sorry, same on the section 3, the fourth column, cost to agency of digital services. Why, what is,
For the per diems,
why is that, okay.
for the members of the task. force.
And just like that, the money runs through ADS.
Yes, so similar to the school construction advisory board, that would be, the per diems would need to be covered by the Agency of Education, but there's not an appropriation made in the bill specifically for those per diems. Often when there is a task force with per diems, there's not money appropriated for those per diems. They're included in that, the appropriations made to that agency or department.
Are you confused about why the GIS office is involved in this? Or not?
No,
Okay.
I just more, I was curious as to why it wasn't going through AOE, but that's it.
So section 3, this is the school district redistricting task force. So this is a little bit more information of what we were just talking about. There's 11 members, include VCGI, the director. It's chaired by the Vermont School Boards Association, and there's other members on there as well. And it would convene for up to 8 meetings. And there's a $100,000 appropriation from the general fund to, and I believe that this was an error, to the Office of Legislative Counsel for hiring 1 or more consultants. Originally, this was a legislative task force. And I think that this was just a holdover from an earlier draft of the bill.
So that's something we would need to fix.
Address.
But just to be clear, the Senate version doesn't include, the task force does not have the assistance of the Agency of Ed. It's still just ADS and the task force. So this is an entirely political, technical task. It's not a education task. Is that the assumption?
I can't make that assumption.
I mean, the Secretary of Education's on it and there's a lot of education experts on it.
It's the secretary is on it. So we're assuming the secretary will bring the information.
So it is being chaired by the Vermont School Boards Association. It's got the Vermont Superintendents Association, and also calls for a member with experience in education data analysis. Beyond that, and it would have the Commission on the Future of Public Education chair and the FASBO director. Beyond that, if those are the right people to be on that, or if that's the right assistance for the task force to have, it's not up to me to decide.
Policy choice.
It is.
I'm just trying to understand, because seeing who supports them actually speaks to what they think the work is.
It didn't observation. How much of this changed in the Senate version?
There are changes, you mean compared to the House version? There are changes to this. I can,
It's fine, we can look at it.
I will admit, the House version was many versions ago in my mind, so
Yeah, yeah.
I'm having a hard time keeping
5 members.
everything straight, in terms of what showed up where. But there certainly are differences here in terms of membership
Members.
and assistance. There's also a new section, section 3A. This is transitional school boards. This essentially creates these transitional school boards that are similar to what happened in Act 46. So basically a way to transition between our current state and this future state of school boards. And associated facilitation grants for the transitional school board to help them transition.
I don't hear Jillian in terms of the financial impact, but I think it said in the bill that they were also responsible for creating wards.
The transitional school boards,
I think I'm
There.
gonna try
Yep.
to save Julia from answering all of our questions throughout the first half of the bill.
Never mind.
Thank you.
the,
Sorry, before we move on,
Yes.
on that section, is there, pre-transitional school board, do we have to approve the grant? Is there any reason why there's no money on the table for 3A? Where'd she go? Oh. Some of the chair was there. I was like, oh, well, what a terrible question.
there is no money because we don't have the school district configurations yet. There is something included in the bill that says the secretary shall appropriate from the education fund transition grants that are
Oh, yeah, the table's
equal
all.
to a certain amount.
Wait, doesn't cost anything.
Well, yeah. In Julie's defense, the table says fiscal year 26 fiscal impact, and that would be a 27 anyway, so.
There was a mess on.
I have also a question about 3A, which is probably for House Education to answer, but I just want to put it out there. First, which is, these new boards are going to have an authorized responsibility. Some of them may be quite large, as a matter of fact. There it is. How are they going to get to know each other and understand their responsibilities before they have to make decisions?
Those are great questions for someone other than Julia. Yes, perfect.
Right there, and I'm just,
Thank you.
while we're on the section, put
Yes.
it out there,
Yes.
it's something we need to consider. Thank you.
Julia.
Moving on, section 5, class size minimums. I believe that these class size minimums have been changed since they came over from the House. They're
I think
smaller.
we should skip
Okay,
these sections because I think it's just makes everything more confusing.
okay.
Well, except that it does, I mean, what's interesting about this so far is that we're defining costs purely in terms of the general fund. Right? Because everything in this has implications for ed fund costs.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And that's why
There's no accounting of that in the fiscal note.
I guess I would disagree with that a little bit, because we are speaking to the fact that there is likely to be a fiscal impact. However, it's unclear based off of future policy considerations, like outstanding district boundaries.
Has anyone even been given the average class sizes? Because class sizes have, I mean, teacher counts have been dropping. Support staff have been increasing. Do we even know how these numbers align?
I do not. Did you want me to go through to the funding piece?
I think so.
Okay.
We can come back to this.
Okay. So this is the sort of fiscal note within the fiscal note, the establishment of the new education finance formula and the restructuring of the statewide property tax. So again, fiscal impact of these changes is likely, however, it's unclear because it's dependent on outstanding policy decisions and future demographic and economic changes. We're talking about FY 2030. The bill maintains the House version of the foundation formula, so this should look very familiar. The 15,033 base amount, the same pupil weights. The maintains the support grants for small schools and sparse school districts. However, a difference in how that is defined. So the bill still charges state board with determining schools that are small by necessity, but determines the sparsity to be if a school is located in a zip code that has a population of less than 55 people per square mile, then it would receive a sparsity grant.
Anyone want Julia to explain that again, or did we do that one? Got it. Have you done any more, like in attempting to model this, have you done any more digging in with the TIS office to understand how it might work?
Yeah, I did reach out to VCGI and I actually spoke with the director today, and the way that it's currently drafted, they would not be able to calculate the sparsity of a zip code because the zip code is determined on specific points. It's a way for distributing mail. He had some thoughts, but the zip code, you can have a zip code of a post office, and the zip code is solely for the PO boxes within that post office. So he had said that the way that it's currently drafted, they wouldn't know how to calculate this if it were to be for the coming year. So something to flag. And I would encourage folks encourage you if you're interested in exploring further. He's really the expert on this. So no, I have not estimated it because I do not.
And we can have him share some testimony with us, and Rebecca Samroff is looking for that presentation that I was so excited about earlier, and we'll send it to the committee.
I was just curious in terms of, he could probably do it by town, but not by zip code.
I imagine so.
Like, that data exists, but because zip codes are across town or within town.
Right.
That's what complicates it.
Yes, and I think it's also just the manner in which zip codes are. There's ways of using zip code, slicing the data to use zip code as a geographic proxy.
Yeah.
However, the way that he described it is like, this is like asking someone to how much something weighs in feet. I thought was a really
Good.
a helpful analogy, in terms of the zip codes themselves. My understanding, based on my conversation with him, is that they're associated with specific points on a map, right, to deliver mail. But without drawing the full boundary, it's hard to encompass within that. So it's something to explore. I know that it is consistent. The researchers have used it. So I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in talking with folks who are deep in this data.
That would be census data, right? In terms of population in town.
So we can ask John to look more into it, because
Yeah.
to census,
Right.
it also gets squiggly.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
I feel like this is a conversation we have literally every 5 years. And we could probably even go back to the Act 46 data when it was actually driven by people who actually drove every bus route pretty much. But it may be that mean, I think we have to ask, maybe we look at one grant instead of a weight, possibly. I mean, it would be interesting to know how many schools this is, and
Yeah.
also, because if you
Right.
close the 26 smallest schools in the state, I don't think you'd save a dime, honestly. And so I just think we're making a lot of complication over really not very much.
The next sections are consistent with what you have done here, some conforming stuff. The ballot language for voting on the supplemental district spending. The repeal of the special education census block grant, right, because you're putting in the special education weights. Or this would be putting in the special education weights. The supplemental district spending, the manner is generally the same as what was passed out of here. The only difference is that the amount that a district is permitted to spend above the educational opportunity payment is no longer based on the weighted amount, right? You'll recall that as it passed out of the House, that the cap for supplemental district spending was 10% of the educational opportunity payment, which is base times weighted students. The Senate proposal of amendment, the cap would be 10% of base times long-term membership unweighted.
Can you talk a little more about the implications of that?
That will mean that the amount in supplemental district spending is a permitted supplemental district spending is less under the Senate proposal amendment than it would be under the House proposal.
Differentially per district, the more weighted you are,
Correct.
the lower the
Correct.
the benefits.
Correct.
And when John was here, we talked about the idea that the EOP is sort of compensating entirely for spending differences. Can you expound on that a little bit?
What do you mean?
That the idea that the fact that the education opportunity payment is weighted means that any differences in sort of need per district is already accounted for, and so you don't need to account for it in the supplemental spending reserve.
Yeah, that was one of the big conversations that they had in Senate Finance, sort of the idea that the education opportunity payment, because it's based off your weighted student count and the weights are cost adjustments, that the supplemental, so that the educational opportunity payment was covering those differences in costs of the weights, and that the cap should not be based off the weighted pupil count, but rather just the number of students in the school. So it's a different policy choice. Some reports are included in here. The biggest difference is that JFO would be required to contract for a report to develop a cost factor foundation formula. And appropriates $150,000 from the general fund to JFO to do this, and this would be due in a year and a half. So December of 2026. Then
Julia, the purpose of this report would be what?
to come back with a cost factor report. That includes, I believe that it's required to do if sparsity is the right, how to measure sparsity, and then there's also something about an explicit, actually, I don't know if that made it in. An explicit mention of the high school weight. Did that
Yes.
Make it in?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah, okay. The
Policy jet lag.
I will say, it has been a long session.
And it isn't over yet.
And it's, but important. So yeah, so it includes looking into sort of I think the idea was sort of a deeper dive of a cost factor report beyond the memo. So I think the idea was more similar to the people waiting report of 2019 as compared to the memo of this year.
Madam Chair, I think this is actually more for those who will probably end up on the community conference. I thought we had talked about earlier in the session that best practice was really cost factor analysis with professional judgment panels. And I feel like it's kind of awkward that they're asking for another cost factor analysis when we already have one, but they don't have sort of this additional like professional judgment panels. It just feels very narrow, like we're basically just redoing work that's already been done with a couple of extra, things for them to look at. So I would just sort of raise that potentially and go committee conference.
Appreciate it. Representative Holcomb.
That was very much agree with you on that. I also am concerned that there is a piece that we don't have cost factor data on, and that's the CTE piece.
Mhm.
And we also don't have a vision for what CTE is, so I don't know how to do a cost factor analysis of where you're trying to go if you don't know where you're trying to go.
Also, using weights for CT is sort of weird.
It doesn't make, I guess, I think I've already said that.
Yes.
It makes no sense. But the other piece is that number is very low. I mean, we spent $500,000 on APA to do whatever they did. So I don't know how 150 is going to be doing the replication. And they didn't even do the professional judgment.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Okay, I want to make sure we don't have all that much time left, and I want to make sure that we understand both the transition and the homestead stuff.
Okay, I can go quickly on that.
These are the reason we're going slowly, and all the conversations are worth having. I'm just giving a time check.
So that was the biggest difference on supplemental district spending. We spoke about that, the JFO report, and then there's these two transition mechanisms in the bill that sort of follow the same intuition. The transition to the educational opportunity payment, I think John explained this, that you're essentially calculating a transition gap, which is the difference between the educational opportunity payment and the education spending adjusted for inflation. And what you're doing is you're then taking that transition gap, which could be positive or negative, and multiplying it by a factor over the course of the 4 years. So the transition gap will slowly winnow as you're getting closer to your educational opportunity payment. So either bringing folks up or bringing folks down.
Can you, I'm wondering about sort of recalculating it every year rather than calculating it once and then having it be sort of set for the 5 years.
So the challenge with that is if you were to calculate it once in the beginning, is you're calculating it based off of your educational opportunity payment in out years. So you'd be using an inflation estimate in out years. Whereas if you're calculating it each year, then you know what the educational opportunity payment will be that in that year. It gets into the trade-off of being able to plan in advance versus being more accurate. The difference, sort of the difference with the tax rate transition is the converse of that, where it's planning in advance. So essentially the way that it would work is we would calculate in the year that the foundation formula were to go into effect. If there were to be no tax rate transition, what would the uniform homestead rate be? And what is the difference between a district's homestead rate in the prior year? And then dependent on that difference, that district would get a certain number of cents off of their tax rate to phase them in over the same 4 years, either up or down.
Is the sum of the up more than the sum of the down, or they kind of come in around?
This is another piece where it's going to depend on future district configurations.
Oh, yeah, of course. Great.
And that's another.
Mary and Montpelier together, they would maybe cancel each other out to some degree.
So that's another piece that would need to be considered with future district configurations of how a tax rate transition would work if you were consolidating districts that had different homestead tax rates pre-foundation formula. It's not contemplated here. And then after calculating those cent transitions we used in each year and phasing out, we would then recalculate the homestead rate in order to raise sufficient funds to fund the transition, the tax rate transition cents, if need be.
So one more time.
So if you're solely taking cents off district tax rates, then you're not going to be raising sufficient funds because you're giving certain districts a tax break over the transition years. So essentially what we would do is calculate the homestead rate pre-transition, then calculate the cent discounts, then recalculate the homestead tax rate in order to ensure that the transition cents are fully funded.
And so, at the end of the transition, everyone around the whole state would have the same tax rate, but there would be 5 years of continuing to have very different tax rates from community to community.
Yes,
Okay.
and I guess I should have said that. That's one of the other big changes in the financing pieces is the move away from the 4 property classes to maintain a homestead property class and a non-homestead property class. The Senate proposal would require the Department of Taxes to come back with a report on property classification taxation. And then there's the homestead exemption. I have some slides.
Yeah, let's jump right to those. Unless people really want to spend a minute on, okay.
So there's a lot, probably more slides in here than we need to go through, but I included a lot of slides so that if you were referencing it on your own, you'd have the context you needed. All of the modeling assumptions that I did for the homestead exemption modeling in the Senate were consistent with the modeling assumptions that we did in this committee. Essentially applying the property tax. Essentially what we're doing is we're saying all else equal and all of the assumptions that I've listed here, what would the property tax bill be fiscal year 25 under current law if we were to apply the credit in the same year versus with a new homestead exemption, what would the property tax bill be under this new proposal? And then looking at what's the difference. Would you need to pay more? Would you need to pay less? Would you pay the same? And that's what we did here as well. I'm going to scroll through this unless you want me to pause. This is the homestead exemption as recommended by the House. You'll recall it would cost approximately 45 million more than current law. And we didn't roll that 45 million back into the calculation of tax rates, remember, because of the iterative nature of if an exemption costs more, then you need to raise taxes, which then makes the exemption cost more, and then you need to raise taxes, and so on and so forth. So this is the structure of, you'll recall, as it was passed out of here. And then this is the impact by income and property value. You've got your household income on the left, house site value on the top. Blue represent a decrease in your average property tax bill and white represent an increase. So for instance, because it's in the top left, a household between 0 and 5,000 of household income and a house site value between 0 and 50,000 would see an average increase of $50, all else equal. That's how you would interpret this chart.
That's a clarification question. So, but because the iterative model assumes the 45 million is coming from another source, if we just keep it out of the ed fund, none of these apply. Is that right?
Yes, these would need to change.
So all of these are incorrect unless we're supplementing with an additional 45 million in the ed fund.
I guess I wouldn't use the word incorrect. I would say that based on the assumption that the 45 million is not being raised by the homestead property tax, this is the impact. If the 45 million were to be raised by the homestead property tax, then yes, all of these numbers would be different.
And smaller. The benefit would be smaller. Because they'd have to share, you'd have to equal, you'd have to,
Yes, all of the decreases would be lower decreases or turn into increases. And all of the increases would be increased.
And I think this is one of the reasons we wanted to have separate classifications as part of this bill, is to make sure that that's covered. And as I said before we started this, like the sort of Senate assumption that we should stick to the spending we have, the exact spending that we have this year, felt somewhat arbitrary. And similarly, like we have been moving this bubble around since Act 60. And so it seems useful to break out of that bubble. And it's also like a bubble that we've sort of long accepted in all of this. So either way, I feel like we're still a little better off than under current law, but can we look at the Senate version?
I think the concern is that if we increase spending overall, which we're doing, we're gonna minimize the impact of this.
Yeah.
So the Senate version, this is the structure. They asked me to solve. They looked at a number of different scenarios. They wanted it to cost approximately the same as income sensitivity under current law. This is the closest that we got was 1.6 million less than income sensitivity in FY 25. And this is the structure. They also included a cap on the house site value exemption that the exemption percentage could be applied against. So essentially what this means is that up to 50,000 of household income, the exemption percentage can be applied against that amount, right? So if you make between $10,000 and $15,000 of household income, then you could apply 97% exemption on the first $425,000 of your equalized house site value. Above that, you would be paying full. There would be no exemption. And this is that structure. So you see that step down in the maximum exemption at 50,000, and it phases out at 100,000.
Why?
But just make the math work.
Why does it step?
Why are there like the two things, like why the two things?
So they wanted to squeeze the balloon. This was the Senate Finance Committee, squeeze the balloon in the manner so that the decreases were targeted to the lower income and lower house site values. And there's a number of different ways that you can do it.
And so they were targeting their blue and we were trying to have sort of the whole thing have blue. Okay.
Yeah, so they were trying to target the blue. So then this is the overall structure of what this house site exemption look like.
So if you live in an area where housing prices are higher, it hurts you to use the Senate version. Because you've got to have site value that's for 425, even if you're very low.
So again, you don't have to, I think it's a really important difference between current law and both bodies' proposals. You don't get booted out of eligibility because your house site value is above.
Yeah.
It's just that you're only getting the discount
Yes.
on that first. And I think that's a really significant difference that's really important.
Significant, but it's still
Yeah.
unfair. Depending on what the values are of your house, even though it's the same house.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't like it.
Okay.
Opinions about not liking things today.
I appreciated how explicit you're being. Everyone else is being a little more subtle. Except for Representative Holcomb, who's also not being subtle. Anyone else? Okay, yes, Representative Kimball.
Yeah, I get the targeting. I'm just wondering what is the comparison of the House proposal to the Senate proposal within those boxes? I mean, is it being more generous to the people within the grid within the Senate proposal than was our proposal?
So I think that there would be two things that you need to
Yeah,
You could do that by comparing the two charts.
yeah.
And to Rep. Holcomb's earlier question, the House proposal would cost more than the Senate proposal. So you would need to be operating under the assumption that the 45 million is not raised in homestead.
Yeah.
And if you are operating under that assumption, then you can compare the two charts and look. And that's a really important point that I did include here is that even if two groups, cohorts are experiencing the same directionality, either an estimated decrease or an estimated increase under the two proposals, it's the colors or the shading don't tell the whole story. The story is also included of what is the scale and scope of the impacts. And it depends on the household group because of the different structures, how the two curves line up.
I mean, if we lower spending more, then everything would be blue. I'm not saying that that's possible or ideal. I'm just saying it's like thinking about the bubble. Other questions for Julia about this? Okay. I think we've gotten as much understanding as we can in 2 hours, and I know that it's far from a comprehensive understanding. And I don't know about all of you, but I also needed some refreshing on what we did. And so, thanks, Julia. I'd like to, in a minute, take a vote on whether we recommend a committee of conference. And then I'm going to ask people to watch the House Education testimony after the floor or I don't know, sometime between now and next time we all discuss things. And then we can think about what the committee needs to get up to speed while the committee of conference is voting. The House Education Committee voted 11-0 to go to a committee of conference by way of that was happening while we were doing our work. Yes.
In review on what we did.
Mhm. I don't know.
Is it possible for any of us to sit in on that? We promise not to say anything.
So I imagine the committee of conference, generally the way a committee of conference operates is that you go through the whole thing and side by side as you're going. And so the entire body and the great Vermont public, actually international guests are welcome as well. So watch it on YouTube. But I imagine that Sorsha could set up a particular viewing room in here if that would be cozy for folks. And I don't know what room yet the committee of conference will be working in, but folks can also sit in person in that room.
Starting tonight.
I don't know when it will start, but when we know when it will start, I imagine Connor will send an email to the whole body about it. Yes.
Cool, thank you.
Are there, I feel like we're practicing a lot of magical thinking in this bill, just to be very blunt. I mean, when you look at the staffing levels, districts are bringing down the number of teachers. Where we're growing is in support staff and in social services. And if you look at our spending data compared to, say, New Hampshire or Massachusetts, any of the surrounding states, we spend about $2,000 more on social services in school districts than our neighboring states. And in other states, these are spending items that would come out of the general fund, not districts. And so as long as we have a system that is shifting from the state budget to school budgets, social services, there's no way districts can live within their foundation formula. And my concern is that the entire premise is that if we do magical mergers, that somehow we're going to bring down spending in ways that make it possible for us to have a more sustainable system. Maybe I've just lived through those wars too many times, but I know that the minute that we try to merge and we try to say, you either have to give up your school vouchers or you have to give up your public school, I don't see how we do anything differently. So how can we use this year to try to set up something that's achievable as opposed to something that's magical thinking? And is there a way to address that in conference?
I think it's really, really important to remember, as much as I struggle that this is true, that this year and all the really difficult policy work that we did this year is really the first in probably 3 years of doing that scale of really difficult policy work, right? We have we need recommendations for CTE for next year, for like significant special education work next year. There's a lot of healthcare reform work happening that we are just beginning, we'll just be beginning to see returns on. And so all of that work that I think moves us from, I'm going to call it a vision rather than magical thinking, to a reality of schools where kids are adequate, like are resourced for real quality, is, I think, the work of 3 years. It's not the work of just the single bill. And I see this bill as really placing all the seeds and setting up the structure for that to happen. Particularly on social services, I agree with you. And what we saw during the pandemic is when districts had extra money, they hired mental health staff, right? And that's when they sort of gave up on their designated agencies in some ways, at least in my region.
They didn't give up. They had a statutory obligation to
Yes.
provide services. And so we are punishing them for things that they had no choice about. And I'm just gonna say,
I think that might be true in some districts. I don't think that is true in all districts
that has been coming for years.
for years.
I mean, and part of it is if you underfund the designated agencies and this, I don't blame the DAs, but if they are underfunded and
They-
can't staff, school districts don't have a choice. But we have called for years the school district education fund, but quote unquote state match for Medicaid. This has huge implications that aren't even being talked about.
And so I think well, for one, if you don't think this bill deals with that, then certainly us, a committee of conference might move us closer to dealing with that. But I do continue to think that there's going to be a lot more work that needs to happen next year on that. And this bill is laying the seeds for that. So if, you have very specific things that you think need to be worked on over the summer to go into next year, there are a lot of reports in here. And I imagine reports and next steps would be all open for a committee of conference to be putting more in. And I agree, we have not actually, we talked about the social services a lot at the beginning of the session that didn't make it into the bill.
And my other concern, I feel like there's a little bit of, look over here, schools, when we've got this elephant of 23.3% increase in 13.7% increase in healthcare plans. I feel like we have to have hard
So
conversations.
I have
about this.
not heard anyone try to do that kind of shadow game that you just described.
Mhm.
What I have heard is actually a number of folks from the education community regularly saying, please move us to reference-based pricing in order to bring those under control. And we have a bill that we just passed to do that.
In several years, we'll get the benefit.
Yes, but all of this is, all of this is multiple years out of getting a benefit. We need to go to the floor. We're gonna have a lot more time to talk about this. So I think what's next up is to take a vote on whether we should go to a committee of conference. For me, I feel like that's the best bet to get something done this year.
Want a motion to do that, just so we move this discussion along, Madam Chair?
Sure, thank you.
Madam Chair, I find much to disagree with the dissent Republican. So I move that this committee recommends to go to a committee conference.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, do you have something?
Yeah.
Oh, cool, it's in your lap, I didn't say it. If you could please call the roll.
Yeah, all right. Representative Reagan. Yes, or no?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
I don't remember how it was
Yes.
worded.
And
Yes.
I will vote yes as Representative Burkhart, Representative Feltus.
Yes.
Representative Higley is absent. Representative Holcomb.
Yes.
Representative Kimball,
Yep.
Representative Maslin.
Yep.
Representative Odie,
Yes.
Representative Wazazak,
Yes.
Representative Canfield,
Yes.
and Representative Kornheiser.
Yes.
And so we have voted 10-0-1 to recommend a.
Thank you, everyone. Let's assume